On May 2nd, 1998, Voldemort was defeated, and the Wizarding world entered a new era. One of peace and prosperity, but also one that required wizards and witches to pick up the pieces from the damage done during Voldemort's time in power. This aftermath is never explained in the original book series, as the last chapter of the Deathly Hallows and the epilogue are 19 years apart. We quickly jump from our trio tying things up after the Battle of Hogwarts to them taking their own kids to King's Cross to board the Hogwarts Express. So what happened in between? What were their lives like, and how did the Wizarding world recover after the traumatic events of Voldemort's second rise to power? Well, in today's video, I'm going to answer each of those questions and more as we go through this 19-year gap and take a peek into each character's life and how the Ministry of Magic reacted to the downfall of Lord Voldemort. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to Fact or Fantasy, a channel where we discuss Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, analyzing characters, lore, and more each and every week. As always, I want to give a huge shout out to Jason, Joshua, Timothy, Robo Steve, and the rest of my incredible Patreon supporters who help make these videos possible every month. Now let's waste no more time and get right into things by picking up on May 2nd, 1998, just minutes after Voldemort's death. In the final chapter of the Deathly Hallows, we at least get a glimpse of people's reactions to this incredible event, as Harry navigates his way through the Great Hall of Hogwarts with dozens of witches and wizards piling in around him, wanting to get their hands on their savior, the boy who lived. The book then goes on to briefly mention a few key details that help us kick off these 19 years. We read that the Imperious up and down the country had come back to themselves, the Death Eaters were fleeing or else being captured, that the innocent of Azkaban were being released at that very moment, and that Kingsley Shacklebolt had been named Temporary Minister of Magic. Then the book continues with Harry's final moments as he takes Ron and Hermione to Dumbledore's office, repairs his wand, and then returns the Elder Wand to Dumbledore's grave. And that is where the chapter ends. But going back to that excerpt we just read, we get a hint at the Ministry's first reaction to Voldemort's demise. That's right, Kingsley Shacklebolt stepped in as one of the few surviving members of the Order of the Phoenix. Not to mention, Kingsley had already been working inside the Ministry for years. In the days following the Battle of Hogwarts, the previous minister, Pius Thickness, was removed from his office and scrubbed from the records. Why? Well, unlike the movie, Pius was found to be under the Imperious Curse for the entirety of his term in office. This strange predicament allowed Pius to avoid being sent to Azkaban, but he was not allowed to continue his time in office, and almost as a courtesy, his tenure was omitted from most official ministry records. Then, just a couple of months after the battle, Kingsley Shacklebolt was officially elected and moved from acting minister to actual minister of magic, and began making some changes with the help of Hermione Granger. Which brings us to the summer of 1998, as Ron, Harry, and Neville were all offered positions in the Auror Department. You see, prior to the war, Aurors were required to have at least 5 newts with grades of exceeds expectations or better. But after the Battle of Hogwarts, Kingsley changed the rules so that anyone who fought in the battle and was of age could automatically be accepted into the Auror Department. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Forget newts, if you battled Death Eaters and monsters firsthand, you earned a spot as an Auror. J.K. Rowling once said in an interview that it made sense for the 3 boys to skip their 7th year at Hogwarts and instead join the Ministry, because psychologically it would have been difficult for them to go through such a difficult and traumatic event and then just return to normal school life. They would have felt relegated to the sidelines while the Ministry cleaned up the mess. So they were more than happy to accept when Kingsley called for their assistance in rebuilding the Wizarding world post-Voldemort. A lot of this work involved rounding up corrupt wizards and witches who were trying to pull a Lucius Malfoy by acting like they weren't really Death Eaters when they definitely were. But for now, let's press pause on Harry and Ron as we check in on the 3rd member of our Golden Trio. Unlike the boys, Hermione could not skip her last year at school. That would be insane, right? Trauma or not, she was going to finish her classes and get her degree. So she went back to Hogwarts for the 1998-99 term and of course graduated top of her class, with Minerva McGonagall as the new headmistress, by the way. This would prove quite useful later on in her life, as the Ministry of Magic still respected formal qualifications and achievements. After all, simply saying that you helped to defeat Voldemort doesn't earn you a place in the top leadership roles at the Ministry. Unless you're Harry Potter, of course. And speaking of which, let's return to Harry and Ron, as in 1999, they began to absolutely revolutionize the Auror Department. Of course, the entire ministry was undergoing a massive reform under the leadership of Shacklebolt, and the Auror Department was no exception. The young Aurors brought a fresh perspective to this organization that had been utterly compromised during Voldemort's reign. If you think about it, the Auror Department was completely corrupt, and I'm willing to bet that Kingsley had to essentially rehire an entirely new group of people. So Harry and Ron led the charge in reforming this new group. One of these new decisions was to fire the old guards of Azkaban, who had proven unreliable and dangerous. Of course, I'm talking about Dementors. And besides being willing to switch to the dark side without hesitation, these creatures are extremely brutal and cruel to the inmates of Azkaban. This always seemed odd to me that there was no in-between. I understand putting someone like Bellatrix in a place like Azkaban, but what about someone who is just a common thief or gets too many parking tickets? You're gonna stick them next to the Death Eaters? So it's good that they made this change, as Kingsley replaced the Dementors with regular Aurors, making Azkaban a somewhat normal prison. On top of this, the next few years were spent purging the ministry of corrupt officials who collaborated with Voldemort's regime or had been compromised through coercion. Which perfectly segues into Dolores Umbridge. During her time as the head of the Muggle-born Registration Commission in 1997 and 98, Umbridge performed unethical trials against witches and wizards who were of Muggle descent. This commission was of course one of the first to be disbanded, as it was pretty much formed only because of Voldemort's control over the ministry. And Umbridge had no claim to be under the Imperious Curse, as she was fully on board with the pureblood supremacy that Voldemort was pushing. She was imprisoned in Azkaban, and that symbolized a great victory against this dangerous ideology, and helped begin a new era of peace and equality inside the ministry. But what about the people who unintentionally were fighting against Harry? People like Fudge and his followers who were simply ignorant? Well, that brings us to Percy Weasley, who had his own redemption arc in the years following the final battle. It was during the battle itself that Percy reconciled with his family, and later he rebuilt his ministry career from the ground up. Percy eventually accomplished his goal of holding a very important office in the ministry, as he was appointed the head of the Department of Magical Transportation, which obviously is a very Percy-type role. Not only did Percy find happiness at work, but he married a woman named Audrey, and they had two daughters, Lucy and Molly. And with that, we can finally head into the early 2000s, which really was the baby boom of the wizarding world. On May 2, 2000, exactly 1 year after the Battle of Hogwarts, Bill and Fleur had Victory Weasley. I honestly have no idea if I'm saying that name right, but I believe the name translates to victory in English, so I'm just gonna go with that. Despite Bill having suffered an attack from Fenrir Greyback during the war, he survived and built a great life with Fleur, as they ended up having 3 children. Victory would later go on to become a student at Hogwarts during the same time as Teddy Lupin, and they eventually became a couple. I tried finding out if they got married, but I don't think that was ever confirmed by Rowling. But now moving on, we come to George Weasley and Angelina Johnson, who ended up getting married in the early 2000s and having 2 children, Roxanne and Fred II. This is one of the weirder twists, but I guess trauma does crazy things. If you remember, Angelina was kind of Fred's girlfriend at Hogwarts, or at least they went to the Yule Ball together. So George marries his dead brother's ex-girlfriend, which seems strange, but oh well. Other than George's family, he continued Fred's legacy by continuing to grow the Weasley's Wizard Wheezes shop, which was a massive success. And that leads us into Ron's later decision to leave the Auror Department. After having done some great work with Harry to reform the department at the Ministry and clean up the mess that Voldemort made, Ron decided it was time to settle down. So he left the Ministry and joined his brother George at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. This allowed him to be with his grieving brother and take a step back from the intense work of being an Auror, which allowed him to start a family with Hermione. We aren't given an exact date of when Hermione and Ron got married, but we do know that they had their first child around 2006. In total, they had 2 children, Rose and Hugo. As for Ginny and Harry, the time of their marriage is also up in the air, but they too began having children in the mid-2000s and ended up with 3, James, Albus, and Lily. But moving past the baby boom, let's refocus on Hermione, who has obviously now graduated from Hogwarts and began her work life. As you can imagine, Hermione began her post-Hogwarts career in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. This is where she continued her work with Spew and her passion for equal rights for house elves and other magical creatures. Working alongside Kingsley Shacklebolt, Hermione helped to eradicate pure-blood legislation in the Ministry, as well as create equality for creatures like house elves. All of this eventually led to her ultimate career achievement, being elected Minister for Magic. But that's jumping a bit ahead, because technically, during the epilogue, she had not yet become minister. But I wanted to throw that out there anyway. Now going back to the mid-2000s, we get an update on Ginny. Always a skilled Quidditch player, Ginny chose a different path from the others, avoiding the serious slog of ministry work, and chose to take a position as a chaser for the Holyhead Harpies. Then, years later, after finishing her professional career, she became a sports journalist for the Daily Prophet, and eventually achieved senior Quidditch correspondent. But now let's get back to some of the baby boom. We need to reconnect with a couple key characters. First, what happened to Draco? Well, after avoiding Azkaban, Draco chose to distance himself from his family and live a life of peace. He married Astoria Greengrass, a woman who shared similar pureblood heritage but without the darker beliefs of the Malfoy family. Together they had Scorpius, and thanks to Astoria's encouragement, Scorpius grew up very different from how Draco himself had been raised. Despite this, the Malfoy name would forever be tainted due to their involvement with Voldemort, and they narrowly missed a sentence in Azkaban thanks to Narcissa's role in saving Harry's life by lying to Lord Voldemort. Now moving on to another prominent figure, we return to Neville, who, if you remember, had accepted a role as an Auror alongside Harry and Ron. Well, after some years working for the Ministry, Neville was offered a role at Hogwarts in the Herbology Department. He took the job, leaving the Ministry work behind, and married Hannah Abbott from Hufflepuff. So you might be thinking, what about Luna? I thought Neville got together with her. Well, that's only in the movie. As for Luna post-war, we learn that she became a magizoologist, which took her all around the world and is how she met Rolf Scamander, the grandson of Newt Scamander. Luna and Rolf eventually got married and had twins, Lorcan and Lysander. Finally, we learn that by 2007, Harry had been appointed the head of the Auror Department, after working for years under the leadership of Kingsley Shacklebolt. And so, from 2007 to 2017, when the epilogue takes place, Hermione is working in the Ministry, Ron is working with his brother in Diagon Alley, and Harry continued his work in the Auror Department. And that's pretty much it. 19 years after the Battle of Hogwarts, we see the Golden Trio and their families bustling through King's Cross as their own children embark on their own journeys throughout the wizarding world. While there's a lot more that could be covered, I decided to stick with the main characters for today's video. If you'd like to learn more about some of the side characters that we didn't address today, you can drop a comment below. Unfortunately, there's a lot that's unknown about this gap, because Rowling didn't really expand on this other than in a few select interviews. And while The Cursed Child offers some explanation, it isn't considered canon by a lot of Harry Potter fans. But if there's anything I missed or got wrong, be sure to drop a comment below. And if you're able to drop a comment filling in some of the gaps during these years, please do. As always, if you enjoyed, be sure to like and subscribe. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next video.